what's going on, for a physical environment. To bring some validity to this particular study, we had two different cells. The first cell, we basically did a planogram with Kellogg's traditional method. So we used exactly the same planogram configuration that they normally would. They were introducing a new product. And then we introduced a secondary cell with the product in another location. The outcome of this particular study was that we could actually relocate the product out of the prime location within the planogram to another less prime location. And ultimately that created a lift of 18% across the entire category as opposed to just the particular product. So Kellogg's was able to avoid cannibalization of their revenue by looking at the data in different ways and from different angles.
Sweet. All right, and I think you got your projects down. All right, so now let's get to the questions. I'm sold. I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel like this is really exciting to hear all the different range that VR can have as an impact, and particularly now when we talk about this for Interpret's training. Where do you guys see, because I think all of you guys are now breaking into like leveraging all the knowledge that you have gained as researchers of VR, and you're getting solicited by workplaces, maybe unintended or not, but this market is really growing. Where do you see the limitations for VR training in relative to each of your different expertise? Feel free to anyone. I think Courtney would be interested.
Yeah, so in my space, so we're being approached by a lot of people who want to think about applying this in like diversity, equity trainings in corporations and that sort of thing. I think I won't describe it as a limitation, I will describe it as a concern, is that people jumping into the space who don't actually have the skill set necessary to do the work. And it's really the sort of work, especially if you're thinking about social impact or measuring human behavior or impacting human behavior, you really need a multidisciplinary team that's thinking about the content and what you're trying to do. How does the human brain work?
Yeah.
How does human behavior work to design some of these tools? And I think one of the concerns I have is people jumping into the space because it's interesting, or they think there's money to be made, and they don't actually have the team necessary to develop substantive content. So that's a worry I have. I'll give you one example without naming any names, just in case you're in the room. But people, for instance, someone approached me about a project where they were interested in sexual harassment in the workplace. No one on the team had any background in that whatsoever, but they knew it was like, me too, hot topic, let's jump in, let's create a VR where you have to do X, Y, and Z. And the whole thing was incredibly problematic. It wasn't going to work, and they had no idea how they were going to measure the effect of it anyway.
Yeah.
And so I think some of that is a concern for me.
So it's more so on expertise in the workplace into onboarding or integrating VR training that you feel like is the biggest limitation.
The type of teams that you put together to do this kind of work.
Right.
And I would build on that just to say that there's a tremendous amount of VR content out there already. And I think rather than like charging ahead with like, this is my idea, this is my singular vision, I'm going to execute it in the next 3 months. Like, I would really just encourage people to slow down and like maybe spend at least like a certain period of time demoing what is out there, talking to the people who, you know, are already in the space, who have already like been able to like conduct some research, and maybe are like working out interesting like interaction designs or interesting interaction mechanisms, because maybe it would make more sense to partner with other people in the space, and it would be more efficient to do that, and then you can actually build on like the connections that other people have, because I think there's so much content out there that you can learn from, rather than just adding one more, like really try to create signal and not add to the noise.
Right.
I would also add that having a very small scale study within an enclosed space is a very different story, very different category from scaling up out into the field. And so we've been taking a lot of studies out into the field, into the wild. Right now we're working with the YMCA of Metropolitan Atlanta. We're going to 24 after school programs, hundreds of kids using mixed reality, and trying to launch something at that scale is very different. You run into all sorts of infrastructure problems, training problems. People don't know how to use, they break things. Kids break things all the time. Parents are concerned, ethical issues, data privacy issues. And so I think when you're trying to do something like training, which involves hundreds of employees where you need to scale things up, things need to happen in phases, and after each phase you need a very thorough and rigorous and systematic evaluation. So you need to assess every step before you kind of keep going, so that you don't end up at a position where you're like, what just happened? It was a complete failure.
Right. Right, like how, like a set, like start at the beginning and be like, how are we gonna know if we're successful?
Yes.
And then like you can revisit that afterwards.
And I think it doesn't require, rigorous academic research in all cases. There's ways to introduce these metrics in meaningful ways. You find your metric, your target audience, and think about ways to measure that. It doesn't have to be a longitudinal,
Yeah.
randomized control.
But I would agree with everything you guys just mentioned. I mean, we have clients that approach us that, they assume that we can just kind of install analytics and boom, ROI, like we're going to be able to suddenly here we go, we can take this to management and we're done, and they have a terrible experience that doesn't have necessary ROI in it, right? So, I think that the content quality, the expertise of the content creation, and, building something that addresses what you're looking for is ultimately key. And then tools like ours can obviously just, give you that ability to measure that, kind of out in the field with your employees and see how it's, working with your workforce.
Okay, so this is good. So this is a great point. So basically expertise, making sure there's expertise handling the onboarding and creation of these type of solutions. So talking to these companies and developers in the room that may not be the experts, but have this really great idea and they know that this solution is out there, how do they go about getting the expertise? Especially since within enterprise timelines, they're usually really quick turnarounds. So what resources would you say are available, or how do you feel that researchers should be involved, and what should how should they be communicating with each other to make sure that research is involved in that development process?
I feel like they should be involved in everything. But I have worked with companies who are quite unsure of the level that researchers need to be involved with in terms of the project, and so we'll usually have a conversation right at the beginning in terms of laying things out. What role would I play, and for how long, and at what point should I go in? And that's really helpful in terms of getting a practical understanding for all of the parties involved. But if you don't integrate the research from the very beginning, what happens is that the research becomes very reactive in terms of there's not much I can tell you outside of the fact that whatever you have right now works at this level. But if I were involved at the very beginning designing stages of the project, then it would have been much more substantive. It would have been front-end evaluation, telling you what steps, directions to go to, rather than giving you a much more reactive perspective.
A successful pilot to us usually comes in where they thought through what the hypothesis is for the overall scenario, like what they're ultimately trying to prove, and it's being thought through from day one. They have an idea of the problem they're trying to solve for the business. Maybe they're trying to reduce cost of training, maybe they're trying to improve safety, and they have a number of internal as well as maybe even quantitative metrics from the experience that they want to be able to measure, to be able to kind of define what is success, right? So, perhaps it's better efficiency in a particular process. How long did it take users to complete that? How efficient were they, going through those experiences, or maybe it's something else that's going to be a little bit more difficult to measure, like, practical safety issues in the field that's going to take a lot more thinking to be able to actually quantify.
So it would be safe to say that all four might agree that there should be an actual research methodology approach to developing a solution using VR.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you put together a panel of researchers.
All right, I would play devil's advocate now. All right.
You also brought up timeline and
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
would just also say that you can learn a lot about just from paper prototyping, even before you build things in VR. Like there's an element to user research that can be extremely low fidelity. Like even if you're building a VR application, There's paper prototyping that I've used before to help think through like, all right, what is this flow going to be? There's also a bunch of augmented reality apps that you can use on your phone. There's Torch, Adobe Aero, and now there's Reality Composer if you have the latest version of iOS that's from Apple. And you can actually start to spatially like lay things out to explain your ideas on an iPad or an iPhone or an Android phone. So you can really, really start to explain to people, this is what the potential like VR application is going to look like. And yeah, is it like low fidelity? Yes, but did you make it in under an hour? Yes. And so I just really want to like say there's a ton of like savings in terms of time and resources that can come from, you know, taking this design thinking approach.
Right, okay, so let's hit that point home. I think that's an important one to make. What are the consequences of not having research into the process? I have 2 months to build something. I'm pretty sure my solution's right.
Yeah, because I think I get a lot of questions in terms of, well, if it's just me asking users whether they like the content or whether, you know, the equipment was comfortable to use, then why do I need a separate researcher? I can ask the user myself. Well, there is actually a science to asking these questions, and you know, the way that we define things, the way that we conceptualize things need to be very exact so that they're measurable, they're quantifiable. It's kind of like how you would evaluate the performance of someone else. How do you do this when it's all fuzzy and it's vague? And so we know, or we are trained in terms of even asking the right questions in a particular way so that it's reliable and we're able to validate the ways that you're measuring user experience both in and outside of VR. And I think what's really high impact with all of these experiences is that the virtual experience, as you all may know, doesn't end in the virtual world. It transfers into the physical world and it changes the way that people think and behave even after they've left the virtual world. And it needs to be a very much more quantified it's also qualitative as well in terms of measuring how their feelings and thoughts and behaviors are being changed for how long. And in comparison to what other platforms that they've been exposed to. So lots of different elements that are sort of vague until you're able to define it in a much more clear way.
Right.
Yeah, I think measuring human behavior and emotion is really hard,
It's hard.
to do. And so, in all the ways that Grayson just talked about, I also think though that sometimes VR, like, it's complicated. I think VR is sometimes held to an unfair standard where it gets put under this magnifying glass. But I think that's in part rooted in we've made some big claims about what VR is doing without having the data to really support that, and people are pushing back on that, right? So are you really shifting empathy? Is it really going in the direction you thought it was going? Is empathy even the outcome that you should be focused on?
Right. Or what is empathy?
What is empathy? How would you measure that? What does that mean? Is that sufficient? And I think it becomes really, really important in spaces where you're thinking about social impact, you're thinking about influencing human beings. And I think we need to think about it not only in terms of marketing and business and enterprise and academic research, we need to understand what the virtual reality games are doing to people when they go through these. It's not the same necessarily as sitting and holding a controller, and I think there's not enough that we understand about what VR is really doing to people over long periods of time.
Right. I remember, Grace, you've done a study, studying the impact of how long a VR experience has on a person. Like, do you remember those numbers? I always forget, but I know it's like something like 5 minutes lasts 24 hours, or.
Well, we've done several studies where we will measure the immediate impact, and immediately afterwards, it's almost as if VR doesn't have a much more significant and meaningful impact compared to, let's say, reading a book or a pamphlet or watching a video. But I think where VR shines is over time. So 1 week later, 2 weeks later, we'll ask the same participants again, what do they feel like? How was your behavior change? We'll measure behavior. And it seems like a lot of the times VR experiences last over time and doesn't really dissipate. It's really hard to forget all the sensory information that you receive from a VR experience, whereas something that you read in a pamphlet, something that you saw in a video is much easier to forget over time. And so we see over and over again that after a week, after 2 weeks, that few minutes of VR exposure lasts with them for a fairly long time, even after they've left the lab.
So for better or worse, right? You're giving people these virtual memories, so to speak, that might be impactful. We had a white woman who went through our VR experience, and several weeks later said she was standing on the street in New York and a police officer was walking toward her, and she got scared, and her heart rate increased and her hands started sweating, and she said, I've never been afraid of the police, but I was scared in that moment on that day, and she likened it to going through the virtual reality experience. Do I want to do that to people? Is that the sort of memory I want to leave people with? I have to think about what it means to create these experiences in VR.
If we see results in training where we're imprinting process on people and they can recall the behavior that they did within virtual reality and then take that out into the field, what you're saying here makes total sense,
Yep.
right? Like it's,
Yep.
you're taking those behaviors and the things that you learned into the real world.
Yep.
Okay, so the last, it's 5 minutes. Oh my gosh, it went so fast. I wish we had like another 2 days. So I did a poll like out to the Twitter community, Twitter world, to ask to see what the community had questions for you guys on. Some of you guys have already seen it because I tagged you all. But I'm going to go ahead and ask some of them, and we're going to try to do these lightning rounds. I think we can get these done in like 3 or 5 minutes. So first question, what VR metrics are overrated, and could it be considered possibly fool's gold in terms of VR capability?
Implicit bias.
Ooh. Okay.
Yeah.
No one else?
Keep
No one else?
going.
Okay. So do you segment research by user demographics? I guess
what?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, we
When do you do that?
Well, when the different segments will have something interesting to say, like something, yeah. So I did a study where I only recruited people who were experts in spatial design. So I recruited people who were retailers, interior designers, and architects, and I only talked to them, and I did not talk to like just general people, because I really wanted like specific insights from them.
And you guys find that there's usually a difference demographically with responses to the same VR experience? Yeah. Okay, at what point should a company or a developer pivot in the research and development process if results are not going in the direction that they like or that they already promised?
As soon as possible.
I mean, as soon as they surface data that tells them that things aren't working out, they should try something new.
Yeah.
So they shouldn't like hold out and like
Don't double down.
don't double down. How do you get significant results with low numbers of users?
Oh, you should not look for
do that.
significance in small numbers of users.
What was that?
You shouldn't look for significance in small numbers of
Ooh,
users.
interesting.
Yeah, because frequent statistics are dead and no one should use them.
Wow.
So,
Wait, because that's interesting because there's like a myth like, then I guess in the UX world it's like if you use a test with like 5 people you get like 80% of your results.
That is a myth.
I will tell you right now that is a myth.
Okay.
that is so the way that I would answer that question is that you can probably get 80% of your learnings. Like you can get a tremendous amount of research insights from a group of like a small group of people. But the thing is that if you're trying to extract a p-value and try to get a really small p-value, it's like you're gonna have noisy data unless I would say like you need at least 50 people per cell to have like really reliable results. And so what I would say is that people are over-relying on significance testing, and it's led to like tremendous problems in academia in reporting on significance testing and small numbers of people.
Because
And
we just don't know if the results that you get from 5 people are reliable, in the sense that if I test it with a different group of 5 people, is it still going to carry over? If I go over into a different country with a different set of new 5 people, is it going to carry over? So we just don't know with a very low number, even if you have a significant p-value or a statistically meaningful value, it just doesn't carry over. We just don't
So you
know.
should train your target audience to not ask you for p-values. That's what you should do. That's because like, yeah, just like Grace was saying, you can still get a ton of insights, you can still get a lot of valid like research insights, but do not rely on p-values to sell your work. Like your work should have other meaning, and you shouldn't just be relying on like what one particular number is, because it's a very noisy number.
That makes sense. Okay. So how do you set up control groups for non-VR participants?
Don't let them go through VR.
No.
Give them other types of, give them like Grace Ann was talking about, like have them read a pamphlet, have them engage in a more traditional way, an alternative.
Yeah, we try to make sure to make both of the conditions fairly equivalent in terms of the amount of information that they get, so that we're not giving one a ton of information and the other no information at all. I think the only thing that we want to manipulate with the VR versus non-VR is that the information that the participants receive are equal. However, the platform in which they receive the information is different. And so I think you have to really think carefully in terms of what is it that you're manipulating? What is that one thing that's different between these two? And then you try to keep all other elements as equal as possible.
And there's multiple types of controls, right? So that you don't just have one
Yeah.
control. You may have different types of control comparisons that you're looking for in relation to your main treatment.
Cool, thank you guys. So 1 minute left, and this on a positive note, what are you most excited about for VR, maybe entering the enterprise space from your perspective?
I think I'm super excited that when I first started working with Jeremy at Stanford, our headsets used to be in 2006 $50,000. Yeah, $50,000, and I'm really excited at the fact that now it's just so, it's like maybe a third of the cost of a cell phone, a smartphone. And now the idea that we've had for such a long time, the idea of ubiquitous VR that's more commonplace is now feasible. I don't know if we're there yet, but it's getting there in terms of the accessibility. And so I think that's really exciting in terms of scaling up. And so we're trying to take a lot of the work that we've done in the laboratory and see how it holds out, it pans out when it is scaled up. And so that's pretty exciting for me now.
Cool.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if you're an airline pilot, you book time in the simulator. And I think we're kind of getting to a point with virtual reality, even augmented reality, where we have life simulators and work simulators. And I think that it's a really interesting, time to, be in this space. I think that the way that people work and the way that people consume knowledge is going to be completely changed.
Yeah. I'm excited about, we're doing work at Columbia, bringing people who aren't in the tech world at all, but bringing their domain expertise to tech. And so we're thinking about ways to intersect social justice, people who do community-based work, and bringing them to the technology, because I think their voices are incredibly important in the space.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be tremendously fun. Like, I've sat in so many terrible employee trainings when I used to be an employee, and I think I saw that Visa created a training for their employees to help them detect fraud, and it was basically a game, and they found excellent results. Their employees were much better at detecting fraud as a result of going through this VR game. And I don't know how they were teaching fraud detection before, but if I was given the choice, if I was given a choice, then I would want to do the thing that was more fun and was definitely effective.
All right, thank you so much again. Oh my gosh, this was exciting to talk to you all.